So the title that I have for Ephesians chapter 4, we're actually going to begin in verse 17, which is where we left off, is Instructions for Christian Living. That's the title that editors put, but it begins this way. Paul writes this, "So I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they've given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed." Sounds like a fun place to start, doesn't it? It sounds great. You may read that and go, couldn't we have started with something a little lighter? The first thing that I think is important for us to understand is we're working our way through Ephesians, and this is where we landed. But as we work through it, what I want you to read here, what I want us to understand and to see is that the first thing I think Paul is talking about is that this is a heart issue. It's a heart issue. All right, so Paul writes, due to the hardening of their hearts. So I want you to keep that in mind. Because I think what potentially happens as we read this and we go, hey, Paul's talking just simply about knowledge. He's talking about head knowledge, about information, about how smart you are or not, right? And we've kind of fallen into this trap of thinking, well, if I understand, if I know it, if I could memorize it, if I read it and I absorb it and I memorize it, okay, great. It's kind of like math, like 2 + 2 still equals 4. So 30 years after somebody tried to teach me that, you notice I kept the math analogy very simple. Very simple. But what Paul is not talking about, in fact, is this type of intelligence. Paul's not talking about a certain threshold of intelligence required to become a follower of Jesus. That's not what he means by knowledge. That's not what he means by ignorance. And so while we might ascribe that meaning to it and think, well, great, this is a really heavy place to start, Paul's simply saying, hey, listen, some of you are smart enough to understand the truth, and some of you are not smart enough to understand the truth, would be a very unhelpful road to go down for us as a church. So what is he talking about? I think Paul is saying simply this. I say simply, but he's saying that there's something fundamentally affected within the human mind of all of humanity. And so it could be because of sin, it could be because of the fall on Adam and Eve, because of separation between God and humanity. You can take your pick of how you describe it, probably all of those things. The point that I think we need to take away from these lines is that the reality, if we accept it in these first 3 chapters, of sin and of brokenness that exists inside of humanity, which is core to the understanding of Christianity and why Jesus had to come, why Jesus had to die. If we understand that sin exists, brokenness inside of human experience exists, it doesn't just affect the body. It doesn't just affect physical things. It's not just we live and then eventually we die, everything decays. Right, these things, sin and brokenness, they don't just affect some. They affect all parts of all of the human being, all parts of creation, including the mind, including our minds. And because of that, what Paul says, listen, he says, the decisions we make, the things we do, are also affected by sin and brokenness. Darrell Johnson puts it this way, and I appreciate the way he just words simply complex things. He said, Paul wants us to realize that the fall has affected our minds. What Paul believes, Jesus teaches us, is that when we learn Christ, we learn that the fall also affects our brains. Our brains are not able to function as they were intended to function. The outcome of this is that the way we act ends up being out of faulty ways of thinking and reasoning. But Paul continues, and this is where I want us to focus the bulk of our attention today. That, however, says, but that, right, is not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new, he says, in the attitude of your minds, to put on a new self. This is what happens when you meet Jesus. It says you take off your old self, you put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. And I do think that this is a great passage for us to jump back into at the beginning of 2023, at the beginning of a new year. Like first, return to in-person worship together, all of us in the same place, as we start the new year. And I probably, maybe you could say, well, listen, you would say that about any place we jump back into Ephesians. But I think that it resonates. The last line, I think, for us, for you, especially if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, should be encouraging to put on the new self. Put on a new self, created to be like God, created for true righteousness and holiness. Like, who wants a new self? Who wants, so there are some hands, and thank you for that vulnerability. I know I do some days, maybe most days, maybe every day in different ways. A new self. A new you. It's the hope of a new year. That maybe this year things are going to be different. Maybe this year I might be different. Maybe this year I might stick with the things that I want to change in my life or see changed. This is the promise that God speaks to in Scripture. You were created for a new self. And I think that longing points to it. I think that longing, every single year, you're like, yep, there are some things of my life that I would rather not do. There are some things about who I am that I would rather not be. And for some reason, every single time I try, maybe I make some progress. Maybe I make a whole lot of progress. But at some point, you just hit this wall. This is the promise that God speaks to. Actually, you were created for a new self. Created to be like God in righteousness, right standing, and in holiness, right living. And the thing that I want you to hear is that you were created for it, not shamed into it, not chasing it endlessly, not constantly finding yourself lacking, but actually designed for it. Now, the reality, though, that you know that I know is we don't always live like it. When I was younger, a little bit younger, not a lot younger, a little bit, I led canoe trips in Algonquin Park. How many people have been to Algonquin Park? How many of you have done a canoe trip in Algonquin Park? That's a little bit different. Okay, all right, this is great. So I would lead canoe trips in Algonquin Park. I would lead canoe trips in Halliburton, all these lake hopping, river trips, different things. And what would happen for us, the camp that I worked for and camped out we would go away for 1 week. The longest I think we ever did was like 10 days. And what we would do is we would take 2 sets of clothes. One would be dry clothes and one would be wet clothes. And the wet clothes, you're like, all right, I'm embracing being wet because there's no hope in trying to stay dry. There's no hope in trying to stay clean. So you're like, these clothes, this set of clothes, this is going to be my wet clothes, my dirty clothes, and this set of clothes, this other set is going to be my dry clothes, my clean clothes. And what happens is they all end up wet and they all end up dirty, and so do you. But it's okay. It's okay, because the thunderstorm you go through on Monday is the same thunderstorm everybody else goes through. And when you wake up on Thursday or Friday, you're like, I stink. So does everybody else. And to add to it, you're like, great, okay, listen, the bears are just going to think I'm part of nature. It's wonderful. They're going to leave me alone. But it's all right, because everybody is in the same boat. Everybody is living inside of the same context. Until you go home. And then you're not. Then it's not okay. I remember on every trip that I led, not every trip I've been on, but every trip that I led, we would always try to make a stop on the way out at Kawartha Dairy ice cream. And we'd roll up, and they'd smell us coming a mile away, forget seeing us. We'd come, we're like, nobody's showered in a week, nobody's worn deodorant in a week, everybody's just a mess. And you're like, all right, what do we do? And so we'd all go up and we'd order ice cream because we've been eating dried meals for an entire week. And then we'd all get stomach aches and fall asleep on the bus. That's basically the way it went. And we'd get home, and it's just this clash of contexts, this clash of culture, this clash of ways of being. And I remember, like, you had to take off all those old clothes because you burned them. And then you had to take a shower, and then you had to put on new clothes because you had to re-enter a different way of being. Like, it wasn't okay. It wasn't okay just to walk around, the way we were on the canoe trip. And I think the reality is we tend to do these types of switches a lot. Maybe even without recognizing it all the time, right? Take off these old clothes because we couldn't wear them anymore. We put on new clothes because we had to live and act and be different. And sometimes we do it in serious ways, and sometimes we do it in silly ways, and sometimes we do it with realizing it, fully intending to do it, and sometimes we completely just kind of fall into it, right? You put on a hockey jersey to go to a Leafs game or to watch it online because the ticket prices are wild. You put on cowboy boots to go to Boots and Hearts. You put on a swimsuit to go swimming. Like, it's simple. Maybe you put on Carhartts to do hard work around your house. You're like, I just got to convince myself that this is going to be worth doing. And so you get changed. And what happens, the funny thing that happens is that it actually just informs, right? It informs how you act. Maybe a little bit, maybe a lot. But it can also begin to inform the way you picture yourself, who you think you are, who you're not, whether you want it to, whether you don't want it to. And we can slip into these ways of being where, okay, in this area, I'll dress, I'll act, I'll live like this, and over here, I'll dress and I'll act and I'll live like this. And what ends up happening is we live these like compartmentalized lives where we put on new selves kind of almost every single day, where we look different for different purposes. And listen, some of it is great. Please wear a swimsuit when you go swimming. Like, it's the safest and best option, okay? I just got to say it. But sometimes it's in more serious and detrimental ways. And the turn that I think Paul wants us to make here is that if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, we put on a new self. Not a new set of clothes. It's an entire new person. It's an old life and it's a new life. And if you don't call yourself a follower of Jesus, you can also put on a new life. That's the invitation of the gospel, is to shed the old life. And it's not that every part of you dies, but it's the parts that God doesn't intend for you to live into that you die to. Everything about you changes. Your core identity, what is truest and what is most important about you, it informs this life, Paul says, it influences everything. So maybe, listen, I'll ask you this question. I don't expect answers. What is truest about you? Even put another way, like, what would your partner or your spouse say is truest about you? What governs your life? What directs your energy? What is the standard by which you make decisions day in and day out? Like, what is the default way of being, your default mode of operating? Because what Paul is saying is that when you become a follower of Jesus, everything changes to the core of who you are. You become new. To put on a new life is actually that, to put on a new life. And everything you do becomes shaped by that way of being, by that identity. Listen, like, it doesn't mean or in any way insinuate that you will or need to be perfect. It doesn't mean that you're not going to mess things up. You will. It doesn't mean that you won't doubt. It doesn't mean that you won't struggle. It doesn't mean that this isn't a process. It is. Like, for the rest of your life becomes a process, but it does mean that every area of your life is impacted. And Paul says it right from the beginning, right? He points us in this direction. He says, you no longer live as the Gentiles do. I think it may be important for, us to understand that, like, when Paul uses the term Gentiles, he's not simply in this case using it to refer to non-Jewish followers of Jesus, but actually simply like those who are not followers of Jesus. It actually reads like something like the nations. the nations. He says, hey, once you've been called to follow Jesus, once you embrace the core message of the gospel, you become different. The implication simply being follower of Jesus, like don't live as everybody else lives. Live as Jesus lived. Some of the hallmarks I think of someone living according to this new way might become this, right? The way you understand who you are changes. The way you do relationships change. The way you, and to notice mean like dating relationships, but all relationships. The way you think about friendship. The way you think about forgiveness. The way you think about reconciliation. All of that changes inside of the relationships you have. The way you spend your money changes. The way you do your job changes. What you do, what you choose to make a career might change. The way you think about sex changes. The way you treat strangers, guests, enemies, all of it changes. The way you drive your car changes. Like if you want the best, like how are you doing emotionally? Like think about the last time you got absolutely like enraged with somebody, another driver on the road. The way you interact with all areas of your life is going to change. The problem, I think, for us as humans is that it just becomes so easy for us to compartmentalize our lives. And we say, listen, this is great. I love all of what you're saying for my life as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, but like I do this job and I can only do it this way, and I've got to work within the confine fair, okay, but it is also going to change. And maybe you think, well, listen, like if this is really true, like I've got to seriously consider like some of my core friend groups, like who am I spending the bulk amount of time with? And now listen, what I'm not saying is that if you are a Christian, you should only have Christian friends. That's the exact opposite, okay? But what I am saying is that people you allow influence into your life like might need to change, and that might be a hard thing to change. Everything made new. The best part, I think, of this entire passage is found in verse 23. And it's, kind of along these lines, this question. How does it happen? How might it happen? The best hope that you can find are in these three lines here. Be made new. Be made new. Have it happen to you. Allow God to do it in your life. Paul says, be made new in the attitude of your minds. It's not make yourself new. It's not figure out what is going to work for you and then try desperately to cling to it. It's not try as hard as you can to achieve something you've never achieved before. It's not be better. It's not work harder. Like the command, if you can call it that, I think it is to allow yourself to be made new. And to be made new actually by one who knows you the best. Studies have shown, and I've quoted these things in years past, 80% of New Year's resolutions are failed, are done. You forget about them by February. Even more interesting, though, I read a stat this year that says this: 43% of people expect to fail their New Year's resolutions. It's like we go into it knowing it's going to happen. 43% of us expect ourselves to fail at it. And every year we tell ourselves the same thing. Man, I'm going to try harder. I'm going to work harder. I'm going to be better. This is like the one area of your life, and maybe the one time, like in the month of January, where you're going to hear this, like, it's not about trying harder. It's not about being better. Not on your own, at least. All you can do, the best thing you can do, is to position yourself for it to happen. Allow yourself to be drawn into a relationship with a creator, with a God who desires to change your life. So what I want to leave us with today is just simply three ways that this year you might try or learn or experiment with positioning yourselves to allow God to change you. Three things that I'm going to try anyways. Learn a little more or in new ways to spend time with Jesus. And that language may sound strange to you, but Paul says something changes in the mind of the believer when you, quote, learn Jesus. or learn in Jesus could be even more accurate. Have you ever watched a TV show or like binged a TV show, more likely, and eventually you realize that you're thinking a little differently because of it? And like maybe if it's like a really high adrenaline and high drama, you just get to a point where you're like, you can't turn it off and you just can't maybe your language starts to change, right? Watch a show with a whole lot of different language in it, and I won't say what kind of language, whatever, but you start thinking a little bit different. The language you use starts to be a little bit different. Yeah, that happens. Maybe you just have to shut it off. Fatigue sets in, like I've had enough, I need a break. Here's the thing, you can't expect God to renew your mind. You can't hope to learn Jesus unless you're actively spending time with Jesus. You need to learn the life, the teaching, the lifestyle of Jesus. And so in the same way that you kind of like accidentally fall into these things, patterns, you speak a little different, you talk a little differently. When you watch TV shows, like you need to just embrace who Jesus is, and the number one way to do that is just simply to read about the life of Jesus. Read the Gospels. And number 2, learn to pray. Spend time practicing prayer. Use this language, practicing. Spend time practicing prayer. Just try to do it. Try to do it, in different ways, in new ways. Learn to sit in silence. Learn to write your prayers. Learn to listen for God's voice. My aunts all sound alike. And the more time they spend together, the more they sound alike. To the point where just before my grandfather died in 1999, they all went down to Mexico. And then they all returned, and you're like, I don't even know which one of you is which, like talking to them on the phone. They're all the same. And prayer is the number one, it's just you learn Jesus, you learn what Jesus sounds like, you learn the voice of God, you learn your own voice in prayer, right? And what happens is, I think the more time we do it, the more we learn to hear and to see the voice and the working, the action of God in the world. Very simply, we need to learn. We need to practice hearing the voice of God. And number 3, we need to find community. You need to find community. There's an interesting study done. It was a study done in rats about overdose. So I realized, as soon as I've said that sentence, this may, it may hit something in you that you're like, I don't like this story, and I know that. I don't know all the ins and the outs of the study, but the basic finding of this study was rats who were put into isolated cages would consume cocaine to overdose over and over and over again. There was nothing there. There was nothing there going for them. There was no community. There was nothing to do except for this thing. You said, well, okay, fair, they're in a cage, but they would return over and over and over again to overdose. Rats, though, who were placed in communal cages, community living rats, like with other rats, would not. And over again, they would find the same thing. Rats in isolation would die. And rats who were in community, socialization, social interaction was the cure. I don't think we have much hope as human beings on our own. I certainly don't think we've got much hope as human beings trying to follow God, trying to learn Jesus on our own, on your own. It's a whole lot easier. It's a whole lot better when you're living in intentional community. Community holds your feet to the fire, right? Community holds you accountable. Community supports you, lifts you up. Community holds on to faith for you when you need to express doubt and fear and uncertainty. Community constantly reminds you that you belong. That no matter where you find yourself along the path and along the journey and along your relationship to Jesus, that there's a place for you at the table. And if you want to live differently, community provides ultimately the accountability and the place for that too. You're not going to earn it. Doing these 3 things perfectly won't renew your mind. You say, hey, listen, you said don't try, and then you gave us 3 things to try. I do believe that these 3 things position you and might prepare you in greater ways for God to renew your mind. And I think that's my prayer for us as a church as we move into 2023, that God would continue to renew our minds, our hearts, our lives, our church, and in and for our communities.